All right, today we're looking at the interaction of hormones at target cells. So multiple hormones may act on the same target at the same time. And there's a couple of different cases for when this occurs. There's permissiveness, where one hormone cannot exert its effects without the other hormone. A great example are hormones like estrogen and testosterone, reproductive hormones that need other hormones to have an effect, that hormone being thyroid hormone. There's also synergism, where when both hormones are present, they have an amplification effect. So when more than one hormone produces the same effects on target cells, they can sometimes help each other. That's the case for glucagon and epinephrine, which when both present can cause the liver to release glucose and abundantly increase the amount of glucose in the blood. Then there is antagonism, where one or more hormones opposes the action of another hormone. Generally, these are seen as antagonistic pairs, like insulin and glucagon. Insulin decreases the amount of glucose in the blood, whereas glucagon increases the amount of glucose in the blood. So we can see that their actions oppose one another. Other antagonistic pairs include parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, as well as aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide. We're going to move on now and look at specific endocrine glands, and we're going to start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is kind of like the boss of the endocrine system, even though oftentimes the posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary, or the pituitary gland in general is sometimes called the master gland. It still answers to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland via a stalk called the infundibulum. The pituitary secretes at least 8 major hormones, and it has 2 lobes, a front and a back, or anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is neural tissue, and the anterior pituitary is glandular tissue. The posterior pituitary is able to secrete neural hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary lobe. The posterior lobe, along with the infundibulum, make up what's called the neural hypophysis, whereas the term adenohypophysis for the anterior pituitary gland does not include the infundibulum, just the glandular tissue. The posterior lobe is neural tissue, and its connection to the hypothalamus is neural. The posterior lobe is just a downgrowth of the brain, and its relationship to the hypothalamus is called the hypothalamic pituitary relationship, or the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. That neural connection arises from neurons in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei, which are cell bodies and dendrites in the hypothalamus. Their axons or tracts run through the infundibulum, and the axon terminals of these neurons are located in the posterior pituitary. These axon terminals are able to secrete 2 neural hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, when stimulated. So the hormones are stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary and are released into the blood when neurons fire. So let's look at that connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So we're looking here specifically at the posterior pituitary, and we can see that these cell bodies and dendrites of 2 types of neurons, we'll say, are located in the hypothalamus. We have the paraventricular nuclei and the supraoptic nuclei. They both have tracts or axons that go through the infundibulum and end in axon terminals at the posterior pituitary lobe. These axon terminals contain the hormones oxytocin and ADH. They're stored there. And when the associated hypothalamic neurons fire, action potentials arriving at the axon terminals are going to cause the release of oxytocin ADH into the blood. All right, next we're going to look at the connection of the anterior pituitary to the hypothalamus. And this connection is not neural, it's actually a vascular connection. So the connection is a blood supply. The vascularly connected anterior pituitary is going to communicate with the hypothalamus via a series of hormone releases. Now, we're going to call this connection between the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus the hypophyseal portal system, and we'll see some other portal systems in the body as we move through this course. A portal system consists of 2 capillary beds and portal veins. So here for the hypophyseal portal system, we have a primary and secondary capillary plexus and a hypophyseal or mini hypophyseal portal veins. The hypothalamus is actually going to secrete releasing and inhibiting hormones from the axon terminals of hypothalamic neurons. Those hormones from hypothalamic neurons are going to enter the primary capillary plexus and then travel to the anterior pituitary via the hypophyseal portal veins, where they will then cause the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary, and those anterior pituitary hormones will enter the secondary capillary plexus and then eventually systemic circulation. So again, let's look at this figure 15.1, so we can see the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary lobe. So there still are hypothalamic neurons, but instead of having their tracks go all the way through the infundibulum, in the case of the anterior pituitary, they stop at the primary capillary plexus. So the inhibiting and releasing hormones from the hypothalamic hormones would enter the primary capillary plexus, travel through the portal veins to the secondary capillary plexus, where they would cause the release of anterior pituitary gland hormones, and those anterior pituitary gland hormones would then enter the secondary capillary plexus and then eventually empty into general circulation. Hormones that are found in the anterior pituitary include growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, prolactin, and luteinizing hormone. So let's just look a little bit more at the posterior and anterior pituitary. So posterior pituitary and hypothalamic hormones. So the posterior pituitary consisted of those axon terminals, and those were axon terminals of neurons from the hypothalamic neurons. We had the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei in the hypothalamus. Their tracks went through the infundibulum, and their axon terminals were in the posterior pituitary lobe. The axon terminals of those hypothalamic neurons in the posterior lobe produce oxytocin, or antidiuretic hormone. Here we can see that it's the paraventricular axon terminals that are storing oxytocin, and the supraoptic axon terminals that are storing antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are each composed of 9 amino acids, and they're almost identical, but they do differ slightly in 2 amino acids. Oxytocin is a strong stimulant of uterine contractions, so we see it released during childbirth. It's going to be a hormone that works via a positive feedback mechanism, which is rare for the human body, but it's also a trigger for milk ejection. Don't confuse oxytocin, though, with prolactin. So oxytocin is a trigger for milk ejection, whereas prolactin is going to be a trigger or hormone that causes milk production. So it's going to act as a neurotransmitter in the brain. It is made of amino acids, so it's water soluble. It uses a second messenger system, but it doesn't use a cyclic AMP second messenger system. It actually uses a PIP2 calcium second messenger system. There's antidiuretic hormone, which is abbreviated ADH, and it's going to act on osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and those are found in the hypothalamus and monitor solute concentration. So if the concentration of solute is too high, that tells those hypothalamic neurons are going to tell the posterior pituitary to secrete ADH from those axon terminals. Now, generally this targets kidney tubules and tells them to reabsorb more water. So ADH targets kidney tubules and tells them to reabsorb more water in order to dilute those high solute concentrations. And this generally will inhibit or prevent urine formation. But the release of antidiuretic hormone is also triggered by pain, low blood pressure, and drugs. We can inhibit antidiuretic hormone by the consumption of alcohol or diuretics, and then high concentrations of ADH can actually cause vasoconstriction. That's why ADH is sometimes known as vasopressin, because it can cause the constriction of blood vessels. Here's just a summary of the pituitary hormones. We've gone through oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Make sure to review why they may or may not be released, what would inhibit them, and in general what their target organ and effects are. Next, we're going to move on and look at anterior pituitary hormones. Also, throughout these PowerPoints, we will look at some homeostatic imbalances. So before we look at anterior pituitary hormones, let's talk about diabetes insipidus and the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Diabetes insipidus is due to a hyposecretion of antidiuretic hormone. This could be caused by damage to the hypothalamus or to the posterior pituitary, maybe even a tumor in the posterior pituitary, and it would require an individual who suffers from this deficiency to keep well hydrated. The syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion is more easily abbreviated SIADH, and this would cause the retention of fluid, a headache, or disorientation. But the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion is a hypersecretion of ADH, and we would see that an individual suffering from SIADH would need to restrict fluid and monitor their blood sodium levels because they would not be able to regulate the solute concentration of ions in their blood as well as they would if they had the proper production of ADH. All right, let's move into the anterior pituitary hormone. So all 6 hormones that we're about to talk about are peptide hormones or amino acid hormones. So they're water soluble, and all of them but growth hormone are actually going to use the CAMP cyclic AMP second messenger system. A lot of them are tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that cause the release of other hormones. The ones that are tropic hormones are follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. The way to remember the anterior pituitary hormones that are tropic is remember that they're the hormones that spell the word flat. So F for follicle stimulating hormone, L for luteinizing hormone, A for adrenocorticotropic hormone, and T for thyroid stimulating hormone. The other hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, the ones that aren't tropic, are growth hormone and prolactin. We can see here the entire word and their abbreviation spelled out. So let's look at growth hormone first. Growth hormone is also called somatotropin. So soma means body, and growth hormone is going to cause the body to grow. It's produced by somatotropic cells and has direct and indirect actions. The direct actions on metabolism are generally going to be glucose sparing and anti-insulin in effect. They are going to decrease the rate of cellular glucose uptake and metabolism and trigger the liver to break down glycogen. Glycogen breakdown leads to the production of glucose, and that therefore will increase blood glucose levels, which is the opposite of what insulin does. Other direct actions include increasing blood glucose levels and levels of fatty acids for use as fuel, and this is going to encourage cellular protein synthesis. The indirect actions on growth are probably the ones you thought of first, where growth hormone is going to trigger the growth of bones and muscles. But growth hormone triggers the liver, skeletal muscle, and bone to produce IGFs or insulin-like growth factors. So the reason that this type of growth is indirect from growth hormone is because it's actually the insulin-like growth factors or IGFs that stimulate the cellular uptake of nutrients used to synthesize DNA and proteins needed for cell division in these organs, specifically bone and muscle. So the formation of collagen and deposition of bone matrix, that's going to be because of IGFs, which are made by growth hormone triggering certain muscles, certain bone, and certain cells in the liver to do so. So growth hormone stimulates most cells to enlarge and divide, but major targets are bone and skeletal muscle, and those major targets are going to be triggered by IGFs. So regulation of growth hormone secretion is going to be by the hypothalamus communicating with the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone release or inhibition is chiefly regulated by hypothalamic hormones on the somatotropic cells. Again, the somatotropic cells release growth hormone. So there's growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone that are made by hypothalamic neurons. Growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates growth hormone release. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone inhibits release of growth hormone. We see that growth hormone releasing hormone is triggered by low growth hormone or glucose or high amino acid levels, whereas the inhibiting hormone is triggered by increases in growth hormone and IGF levels, which were the indirect chemicals that caused bone and muscle growth. Ghrelin, a hunger hormone, is also able to stimulate growth hormone release, but that's going to be a minor stimulus. So let's look at the actions of growth hormone. This is just kind of an overview. This is figure 15.1. 15.5 in your lecture textbook. And we'll look at two images. So here we're just seeing that growth hormone releasing hormone and inhibiting hormone come from the hypothalamus. Releasing hormone causes the release of growth hormone. Inhibiting hormone causes the inhibition, so no release of growth hormone. An increase in growth hormone release can negatively feed back on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to prevent further release if those actions are already occurring. Next, we're looking at figure 15.5, part 2. And we're just seeing here an overview of the direct and indirect actions of growth hormone. Remember, the growth hormone direct actions are metabolic and anti-insulin in effect, whereas the indirect actions are growth promoting and primarily act on skeletal muscle and bone. But they also increase cartilage growth, and they're going to promote protein synthesis and mitosis, or cell proliferation. The metabolic actions, which were the direct actions, are all going to increase blood glucose by causing glycogen breakdown, and increasing blood glucose levels is an anti-insulin effect. We also see an increase in fat breakdown and release. So just make sure to review the direct and indirect actions of growth hormone. A homeostatic imbalance associated with growth hormone is the hypersecretion or hyposecretion of growth hormone. The hypersecretion of growth hormone is usually caused by an anterior pituitary gland tumor. In children, this would cause gigantism. It can cause children to reach heights of 8 feet. When these children reach adulthood, they stop growing in height and they start growing kind of in width. This process is called acromegaly. So it causes the overgrowth or thickening of the hands, feet, and the face. The hyposecretion of growth hormone in children results in pituitary dwarfism. So many may reach the height of only 4 feet. We do have synthetic growth hormone, so as long as children get synthetic growth hormone before their growth plates fuse, they actually can recover from pituitary dwarfism and reach a normal height. So in adults, hyposecretion of growth hormone usually doesn't cause any problems because they have long since stopped growing. So here is the example given in your textbook, figure 15.6. In the middle, we're supposed to see someone who is suffering from the hypersecretion of growth hormone. So they would have, in their early age, suffered from gigantism as a child. At this point, they are most likely suffering from acromegaly. They have enlarged hands. They're starting to have a malformed face, and they probably have thickened feet. In the left, we're seeing someone suffering from pituitary dwarfism before synthetic growth hormone was discovered and or made. And then on the right, we're supposed to have kind of someone who is of a normal height. All right, the next hormone we're going to look at from the anterior pituitary is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone, also called thyrotropin, and its name tells you pretty much what it does. It stimulates the production of thyroid hormone. So from the anterior pituitary, thyroid stimulating hormone will travel to the thyroid. It's going to not only stimulate the normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid, its release is triggered by thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So the pathway we've just introduced is the hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone travels to the anterior pituitary and causes thyrotropic cells to release thyrotropin, also known as TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone will then travel to the thyroid where it causes or stimulates normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid. We can inhibit the production of thyroid stimulating hormone, and this is generally due to a negative feedback system whereby rising blood levels of thyroid hormone or thyroid stimulating hormone act negatively back on both the pituitary and the hypothalamus. We also see that thyroid stimulating hormone release is inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So here is that pathway we were talking about. Much easier to understand, especially when you're learning this information with these pathways. So make sure before you do anything that you're getting a good understanding of where all these endocrine glands are located. And then you're understanding the pathways of this is released and it causes this to be released and it causes this to be released and so on. So let's look at the regulation of thyroid hormone secretion with such a pathway. So what we're seeing here is that the hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone acts on cells in the anterior pituitary to cause thyroid stimulating hormone release. Thyroid-stimulating hormone travels to the thyroid gland, where it causes the production of thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones travel to its target cells and bind to receptors. The upregulation or production of thyroid hormones can negatively feed back on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to decrease or shut off this regulation. All right, the next hormone we're going to look at is adrenocorticotropic hormone, abbreviated ACTH. It's also called corticotropin, but its name tells you where it's going. It's going to the adrenal cortex. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is also known as corticotropin, and then it's sometimes called that because it's released by corticotropic cells. It does have a precursor, pro-opiomelanocortin, but we're just going to focus mainly on the fact that it's called adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's going to go to the adrenal cortex. It's released from the anterior pituitary, and the regulation of its release is triggered by corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. We see the highest levels of CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, in the morning, and it's definitely released in a daily rhythm. There are plenty of internal and external factors that alter the release of corticotropin releasing hormone. So fever, hypoglycemia, and stressors can change this daily rhythm, but in general, we're going to see the hypothalamus produce corticotropin releasing hormone at most in the morning, which will then cause the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, and that will travel then to the adrenal cortex, and it'll stimulate the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. The next hormone we want to look at is a group of hormones called the gonadotropins. They're called the gonadotropins because they travel to the gonads, whether it's the male testes or the female ovaries, and they cause those organs to release more hormones, so hence the tropic part. The two gonadotropins are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. FSH and LH are secreted by gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary, and follicle-stimulating hormone is named after the fact that it makes follicles in ovaries grow, but it's also going to stimulate the production of gametes in males. So in general, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the production of gametes, egg or sperm, in the male or female gonads. Luteinizing hormone promotes the production of gonadal hormones. So in females, luteinizing hormone helps mature follicles of the egg, triggers ovulation, and causes the release of estrogen and progesterone. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone. Testosterone is produced by interstitial Leydig cells of the seminiferous tubules, and we need luteinizing hormone in order to trigger that testosterone production. Luteinizing hormone, though, is named after the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle in females. And so both follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are named after their function in the female reproductive system. The gonadotropins LH and FSH both are absent from the blood in boys and girls before puberty. Upon puberty, the regulation of the gonadotropins begins. There's going to be triggered, or their release is triggered first by gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, but that release only occurs during and after puberty. Before that, it's suppressed, and then there's a negative feedback system that will suppress follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone release once there's enough of it in the blood and it's acting on reproductive organs and other secondary organs. And another anterior pituitary hormone, there's plenty for the anterior pituitary, is prolactin, abbreviated PRL. And it's conveniently secreted by prolactin cells, also located in the anterior pituitary. And similar to oxytocin, it has to do with milk, but it's not milk ejection, remember, which was oxytocin. It's milk production in females. The role in males is not really well understood for prolactin. Its regulation is primarily controlled by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is just dopamine. So dopamine, or prolactin inhibiting hormone, does prevent the release of prolactin until needed. So it's actually the decrease of prolactin inhibiting hormone that causes prolactin production. So with decreased levels, we see lactation occur. But increased estrogen levels are also able to stimulate prolactin release. The reason behind breast swelling and tenderness during the menstrual cycle is because of the small amount of prolactin release due to high estrogen levels. And blood levels rise toward the end of pregnancy for prolactin, and suckling stimulates the prolactin release and promotes continued milk production. A homeostatic imbalance we want to talk about is the hypersecretion of prolactin. So it's more common than hyposecretion. The hyposecretion is not really a problem in anyone except women who want to nurse or want to breastfeed. But hypersecretion generally causes hyperprolactinemia. And that's the most frequent abnormality of an anterior pituitary tumor, is this condition, hyperprolactinemia. And clinical signs of hyperprolactinemia is the overproduction of prolactin, which causes inappropriate lactation, lack of menses, and infertility in females, and it also causes impotence in males. So we finished kind of looking at the anterior and posterior pituitary and their hormones. So make sure to go back and look at table 15.3. Look at the pituitary hormones, their summary, kind of the regulation and their effects. It's a great table as far as summarizing this information. There's a lot of hormones to be looked at for the pituitary gland. And that's it for part A of the endocrine system. Next, we're going to move to part B.